Like when something really major happens, like a car wreck, like say on a road, then all of a sudden all the cars stop or they slow down where that car wreck was. And I think the Virgen is kind of like that. There was something really major that happened in terms of what Juan Diego was doing and in terms of all of the temples that were being pulled down and the books that were burning. Lives were changing. And I think the Guadalupe is a way where we can slow down. She allows us to slow down and still remember.
Bienvenidos. This is Encounter Culture from the New Mexico Department of Cultural Affairs. I'm your host and editor of El Palacio magazine, Emily Withnall. Like every New Mexican, I grew up surrounded by the Virgin of Guadalupe. She graced the hoods of cars, matchbook boxes, stamped tin earrings, jean and leather jackets, plush blankets, murals, and more. She was also tattooed on skin, backs mainly, but also calves and forearms and biceps. I knew of her as the Chicano representation of the Virgin Mary, but until I read Gloria Anzaldua's book, Borderlands La Frontera, in college, I didn't have a firm grasp on where the Virgin of Guadalupe had come from. Though her origins have been written about extensively from many different angles, and although a large number of different groups claim her as their own, Anzaldua helped to give me a starting place for making sense of her cultural significance. She writes, "My family, like most Chicanos, did not practice Roman Catholicism, but a folk Catholicism with many pagan elements. La Virgen de Guadalupe's Indian name is Guadalupana. She is the central deity connecting us to our Indian ancestry." Anzaldua goes on to recount the indigenous fertility goddess, Guadalupana, and the ways the male-dominated Aztec culture then disempowered her by assigning her monstrous attributes. Then, when the Spanish arrive in Mexico, Guadalupana is once again transformed, her monstrous attributes reassigned to the devil, and her benevolent attributes absorbed into the Virgen de Guadalupe. As Anzaldua writes, the Virgin of Guadalupe first appears to the Nahua man, Juan Diego, in 1531. Debate about this history and the layers of colonization inherent to the Virgin of Guadalupe's origins have been accompanied by centuries of religious devotion. For many, her origins encapsulate her role as a protector of all, and particularly those who are most vulnerable and most marginalized. Chicana artist Delilah Montoya captures this sentiment powerfully in her mixed media photo mural, La Guadalupana. Central to the mural, which is now on view at the New Mexico Museum of Art's Vladem Contemporary, is a black and white photograph of the Virgin of Guadalupe as tattooed on the back of Felix Martinez. In the photograph, Felix is wearing a jumpsuit that is unbuttoned on top so he can show his back, and he is handcuffed. In my conversation with Delilah and Vladem Contemporary curator Katie Doyle, we discussed Delilah's artistic process in creating La Guadalupana and the deep cultural significance of the Virgin of Guadalupe in New Mexico and beyond. Welcome to Encounter Culture. Thank you both for being here with me. To get us started, can you both tell us what your name is and what you do?
Okay, sure.
Yeah.
My name is Delilah Montoya, and I am a Chicana artist that has been working with imagery that we find in New Mexico, right? For, ever since I was about 16, I would say. So as a Chicana artist, I had to kind of blaze my own trail because nobody believed there was such a thing back in the 70s,
Oh, wow. Yeah.
80s. Yeah. It was like, nope, there's no Chicanos. Nope. And art, no Chicano art.
Chicanos aren't real.
What is that?
Yeah.
Right. But yeah, so it's, something I've been kind of like working with in terms of creating the aesthetic.
Mhm.
I was really clear about that when I was 16, 17, 18, that this is what I wanted and this is what I wanted to be a part of. I wanted to create artwork that my own community would best understand. Because a lot of the art that you saw, like in museums and at school, it never reflected what it is that I understood best. And what I wanted to do is just kind of like make that visual language more palatable for us.
Mm.
Yeah. And I wasn't really interested whether anybody else got it. They
That's the
didn't
best
they
part.
didn't have to
They don't
get
need
it.
to. Yeah.
You don't need to. There was a particular community that I wanted to speak to.
Hi. Hello. Thank you for having us. My name is Katie Doyle. I'm the assistant curator at the New Mexico Museum of Art, where Delilah's work is currently up. And I think just to kind of echo some of Delilah's sentiments, I also knew that I wanted to be in the art universe, in the creative, field from a very young age. And it took me a while to kind of find that path. I had the certainty that I knew what I loved, but I didn't know how I wanted to love it yet. And over a number of decades, I found that my place is a place of elevating the voices of other artists. And that's kind of what led me into curatorial work and how I'm here sitting with you in this room
Yeah.
in Santa Fe.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Great.
Yeah.
Well, thank you both. Delilah, I want to kind of go back to something you just said
Mhm.
about starting to make Chicano art at age 16 or so. Did you start making art at 16 and what led you to it?
Oh, that's a great question. I can't really tell you when I started.
Okay.
I always made art.
Yeah. Okay.
That was something that is the way that I kind of understood the world around me. I mean, I remember at a really young age in grade school, they were telling me I had to use a brown crayon to draw a tree. And I'm like, trees are not brown. Trees are this color.
Mhm.
Trees are not brown. And it was, always, that sort of thing where I found the better part of myself when I was alone drawing, making work, looking at colors, watching color. I used to love to just watch the slow change of colors in the skies and, things like that. And my mother was very good at just encouraging me. She saw this as being something really admirable and that she wanted to see me do more of it. And yeah, she always encouraged me to just kind of find that part of myself.
I've been working on a separate project at the museum recently, but there's a quote from one of the artists. He talks about how, people are called to make. And the soul connection is what he says, like specifically of like feeling like this is it's a part of you, right? The drive and the need to create things and create them the way that you see them and visualize them in your mind's eye.
Yeah,
There's
something there.
Yeah, there's something there. It kind of like whoop, it rose to the top of my little brain filing cabinet as you were speaking. The soul connection. Yeah.
But the thing is the hard part. There's two parts that are really hard. One is to kind of like figure out what that voice is, trying to understand what it is that you want to say, right? And what really impacts, your kind of lived experiences the most. And the other part is really simple, but it's really difficult, is how do you make work for the rest of your life, right? And that's something I want to do. I want to make artwork for the rest of my life. Simple. But then as I started engaging into the art making and such, I found out that it's like really, really difficult.
Simple, but not easy.
Not easy. Everything gets in the way.
Yeah.
Everything.
So when you say it's difficult to do that, do you just mean that there's not time? Like there's so much other stuff happening in your life?
Well, life happens, right?
Yeah. Okay.
So there's like distraction upon distraction. And, there's, having a daughter at 18, right? That was a real, like, how do I keep making the work?
Mm-hmm.
I remember just watching her in her crib and just starting to draw her, and I would just draw her and draw her and draw her, and I think that was like one of the ways that I was able to kind of like keep it moving. But then the other part was, I was on welfare and having to go through the system because I was a single mom, and they didn't want me to take any art classes.
Oh, wow.
They just came right out and told me, we're not going to pay for that. But I remember just saying, like, I have a right. And if I want to make art, I'm going to make art. That's what I'm going to do. I mean, of course, I take things like commercial art and commercial photography and, all of those things, which was really helpful because I could keep making art.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But, yeah, they couldn't stop me. They thought they could, but they couldn't stop me.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. But the other thing, too, I learned, it was during the time of the civil rights movements. And it was at that point in time, there was a little place called the Chicano Awareness Center that was in Omaha, Nebraska, which I really early on, when I was like 15, 16, I started going there and really locked into the Chicano community that was there in Omaha.
Mm-hmm.
So it was, area where there was a lot of immigrant communities, right? So, like, there was the Polish community, there was the Italian community, there was the German community, and there was a huge underground railroad that emptied out in Omaha. Of course, Malcolm X came from Omaha, right? And that's where he was born. So, growing up, I saw this huge kind of like community of many, many different people, and I saw the mixing, and I saw also the racism, and I saw the race riots, huge race riots, all of that. And so I think that really kind of impacted the way in which I saw, the world around me, and realizing that an artist has a voice, and it's a voice that can speak to identity and speak to our lived reality. And I think one of the things that I was really aware of was the fact that my mother's family had been in the United States, in this territory, for much longer than anybody else that I encountered. We were here for hundreds and hundreds of years, but yet they wanted to tell me I was an immigrant. And I'm like, how does that happen? How does that work? The most recent immigrant in my family was my Polish grandmother, right? And she didn't have problems crossing. She had no problems crossing. Yeah. They welcomed her with open arms. She went through Ellis Island. She was granted citizenship right away. And yet, there's questions whether or not my grandfather was a citizen, and his family had been here for 400 and 500 years. It's like, how does that happen? And of course, going back in history.
Racism is how it happens. It's racism.
Oh, my God. Haven't we seen it? Haven't we experienced it?
Yeah.
So those are the things that, like I had always thought about growing up. And when I started making work, what I really wanted to do is kind of take the iconography and take some of the stories and the imagery that I had seen, particularly within the Chicano movement, to create work that would be viable, that would talk about some of the issues that we experience.
When you say viable, what does that mean, or what did you want that to feel like?
Well, when I talk about viable, I'm talking about the issues that the Chicano community are talking about at that given point in time. All right. And so when I was making that piece of the Guadalupana, one of the things that the Chicano community was really thinking about was, like, who is she really? Is she just strictly a religious icon, or is she a manifestation of the culture itself? So there was a lot of like discussion about her being Tonantensin. There was a lot of discussion about the way in which she's tattooed on the back of prisoners, all of these things. And when I had thought about that, but I hadn't really done a Guadalupana, And it wasn't until Francisco had asked me to be part of an exhibition that he was putting together in France with his wife. It was 12 New Mexico artists. I think it's called Vuelta y Vuela. Could be wrong about that, but it was something along those lines, to exhibit in France. And he had asked me if I would be willing to do something regarding working with the Guadalupana, because there was a 17th century easel painting of the first Guadalupe that had been taken by the Franciscans over to France. And I remember that really sparked a lecture that I was listening to by Flora Clancy. She taught about Mesoamerica at UNM, and I would take a lot of Mesoamerican classes because I wanted to kind of like understand the aesthetic and use that aesthetic in my own work. So she had talked about like, well, there's things that went back and forth between Europe and the Americas. And it was a lot more than just the tomato that went back and forth. There was a lot of ideas and there was a lot of communications that was going back and forth, even in terms of like languages and things like that. And then I thought, well, the Guadalupana went back. And was she the same icon when it went back into the other direction? Was it really understood? And if I'm going to bring her back to France, what can I say about her? That's going to be meaningful, that we begin to understand colonialism and the colonized, right? And then I was kind of like thinking, well, the Guadalupana is tattooed. That's how we really see her over and over and over again within the culture itself. At that time, I was actually teaching at Hampshire College and at Smith College. And it was like really hard for me to to get back. And so, I was kind of like, was looking over some old material because I've moved, and also I have this one-person show coming up over at the Albuquerque Museum, and they want me to, like go back into my archive. So I was like looking at this and I was thinking, oh my God, I found this whole folder just filled of all the tattoo parlors I was calling from when I was teaching over there on the East Coast, so that when I came back, I could just like, just kind of like see what I could find and this and this and that. Right. And I remember calling up a friend of mine's, Cecilio Garcia Camarillo. And Cecilio, at that time, was working at the Mexican consulate. He was a Chicano, and he was very bilingual, so he was able to negotiate he was like a Malinche. He was able to negotiate back and forth. But so what he would do is he would go into the prisons, and the Mexican nationalists that were going to go back, or, somebody had passed, he would negotiate everything. Well, he knew one of the counselors, and he says, well, do you think you could talk to them, see if I could, like, if there's any, like, Guadalupe tattoos in there that I could, like, photograph? And bless him, he did. And there was a counselor that allowed me in, and he connected me with Felix Martinez. And at that time, what I did was I found a whole bunch of people that had Guadalupes, and I just made all these appointments so that I could like photograph all the Guadalupes that I could possibly find. And then I also was able to get into the detention center to photograph the back of Felix Martinez. And I remember, I was at like a party. I don't know if you would call it a party, but anyway, there was kind of like a thing going on over here in Santa Fe. I guess it was a party. And I went with Cecilia, and this guy approached me. His name was O'Shaughnessy. And he just looked at me and goes, Delilah Montoya, I don't want to ever hear that you couldn't get the shot you wanted because you didn't have the equipment you needed. And he handed me his card.
Wow.
I know.
Wow.
I know. And I'm like, wow, you have no idea who you're talking to, because I will take you up on that one, right? And so I held onto his card. And then when I knew I could get into that detention center, I called him up because I wanted an 8x10 camera, and I didn't have one. And I called him up and says, well, I need an 8x10 camera and some lenses, and I need some lights. And he says, oh, come on down. I got down there, and he met me at the back door, and he took me to a locker, and I opened the locker up, and there were these Sinar cameras and lenses, right? And lights and everything. And he says, take what you need. And I'm like pulling these lenses out, and they're like diamonds. I mean, it was just like really, it was amazing. So I just kind of loaded up this old, it was an old car. I mean, I was surprised that he was letting me take that. I mean, this is thousands and thousands of dollars.
Were you
of
driving
equipment.
like a station wagon with wood on the side or something?
Pretty much.
Yeah.
Pretty much. It was pretty like.
I love a station wagon. They're functional.
Well, I never drove station. It was a small car. It was probably like a little Hyundai that I was driving. So loaded it all up, took it to the detention center. We get there. I had Mike Piotas coming with me so that he could touch up the back on the tattoo, because I did meet with Felix so I could like get a real sense of what it looked like and see what the tattoo
When you say like touch up the back, do you mean like he came with like a tattoo gun, or do you mean like
a little marker,
like a little
yeah,
colored in?
Because it's an old tattoo.
Yeah,
right.
Of course.
I'm not doing documentary, okay?
Yeah. We're here for art, all right? This needs to look nice.
This is documentary. This is not documentary. I mean, they just assume like, Chicanos are going to do documentary, right? And it's like, no.
Mm-mm.
Why should I? Mm-hmm. Yeah, because I don't even believe in documentary. Mm-hmm. I don't even really believe that the documentary photographer is doing what they say they're doing anyway, right? They're all making decisions. They're all deciding what they're going to put in and what they're going to leave out, right? And they assume that their voice isn't seen or heard, which is, in my mind, I didn't believe it. So anyway, Mike, you come down here. You got to touch up this tattoo for me. Okay, Delilah. So we go there, and like we have no way of bringing the equipment up. So they bring a laundry cart. And so everything in this laundry cart.
Thousands of dollars of
worth of
equipment.
If Michael O'Shaughnessy saw me, he probably would have like had second thoughts. Right? And so we get there, and I'm setting up the lighting. I'm trying to make sure everything is working. And Mike is kind of touching up that back so that it's going to read well. Because I really needed it to read well because of I had decided that what I wanted to do with this piece was make it huge. Really, really large. I think it was...
It is monumental.
Yeah. And you have to remember, this was done before digital. So I had to really think film. I had to think film.
Yeah.
And I had to think about how was I going to make it go large. So what I decided to do was use an 8x10 camera. That way I could like grid it and print up small details on it like that. So the thing is like, I'm setting it up. Felix comes out, and I'm like, Felix, would you mind if I handcuffed you?
Yeah.
And he goes, no problem. And I think he really liked the idea of, having this kind of like, I explained to him how large it was going to be.
Yeah, the theater of it is really...
Right. Yeah, I think he kind of liked all of that. That, and the other thing, too, is he never really saw the back because it was on his back, so he never was able to really get a good look at it. And I think in his mind he was going to be able to get a good look at it. And so then I set up the camera, had him do a couple poses. I think I tried some with roses. I tried, and then I realized it was just plain like handcuff there before we really began to see the Guadalupe and also see that juxtaposition of the idea of the incarceration, the idea of colonialism, and colonialism really is where that incarceration started.
Yes.
Right. And so I felt like that was kind of like important. And so I was photographing him. I brought like 10 sheets with me. No, maybe it was more like 12, 15 sheets. And I'm like just using the lights. I'm shooting, trying to make sure I'm doing a little bit of moving the f-stop back and forth to make sure that I get a good exposure because it's film.
Yep.
It's film.
It's film.
Not digital.
You're doing this in a prison, and yeah.
Well, in the detention
you probably have
center.
one outlet in the wall that you're working from. Yeah,
which is a very good point.
Yeah,
I blew the circuitry.
Oh, you didn't mention that the last time we talked. I had no idea. Wow, that's funny.
Yeah.
Art is for everyone at the New Mexico Museum of Art. Through world-class exhibitions and educational activities, visitors can gain insight on new ideas, diverse cultures, and the human experience. Visit nmartmuseum.org for tickets, events, and more at both the original location on the Santa Fe Plaza and at Vladem Contemporary in the Rail Yard. Did you know? The New Mexico Culture Pass is now available to purchase online. Culture Pass gives you access to each of the 15 state museums and historic sites we feature on Encounter Culture. Whether you're a local resident or you're visiting us on your travels, reserve your Culture Pass today at nmculture.org/visit/culturepass. And if you love New Mexico, you'll love El Palacio magazine. Subscribe at elpalacio.org. Katie, I would love for you to offer the broader context and talk a little bit about the show Off Center that is at Vladem and how Delilah's work kind of fits in with some of the other art that you've selected for that.
Yeah, so we opened the Vladem Contemporary a little over a year ago now, and a big part of managing the opening of a new building is kind of just like taking stock. You know, we're starting a new chapter of this institution, and so in looking forward, it's also necessary to look back. And we were thinking a lot about, how do we honor and recognize and also take the history of New Mexico art with us into this new century and this new era for the institution. And Off Center kind of was born out of that notion of looking at the last 3 decades of the 20th century and finding a way to kind of shove it all into one show, which was really very ambitious. But one way that we sort of problem solved was, many, many meetings of problem solving and kind of just exploring what story do we want to tell. We realized there's no one way to encapsulate 3 decades of, digital revolution and Chicano movements and civil rights and all of the things that were happening. And so the solution we came up with was multiple iterations of the same show over the course of a year. So the show changes 5 times, and we're about to enter the final cycle that is all about identity. So prior to this, the areas of exploration that we've kind of been shaping the exhibition around have been about place, here and now, spectacle of all of the things that you see when you're here, both, culturally and in the land, and then identity being the final iteration. Alexandra Terry, our curator of contemporary art, and I worked together on this last section, and we really believe that the work itself is telling an essential story about the people here in New Mexico, and an essential story about the militarization of the border, the school to prison pipeline, all of these things that have such a dramatic effect on the people who live here now today. And I think that is also something that makes this work strong, is that, not only is it this beautiful moment captured in time with the photograph, but it is also this work that transcends time and speaks to issues that sit at the root and the core of the culture locally, but also the culture nationally and internationally, in my opinion. I mean, that's kind of how we arrived at this work, and we have it kind of situated around other pieces that kind of deal with gun violence, that deal with family, and these things that sort of are all very close to the heart and close to the home.
Mm-hmm. So I actually want to have you describe this piece because our listeners won't be able to see it. We will make sure that it's up on the website so that people can look at it.
It's big.
It's really big. As a matter of fact, I had to make it smaller for the museum.
No, you didn't.
I did.
From negatives?
From the negatives. Reprinted. I reprinted the whole thing, but I had to reprint it smaller. right? So the other piece is at Williams College has the larger piece. And New Mexico has the smaller piece that fits on your wall. Okay.
This was before my time.
The visual description is it's a man who was incarcerated, right? And he has handcuffs behind him. And on his back is the Virgen of Guadalupe. And it's actually the way the Virgen is tattooed. It's real, you really sense it, that it was tattooed in a prison because it's very much prison art. And actually, I remember Felix had told me that he had gotten this one in California. So it's very much in the kind of the Californian style that was happening during that period of time. And there's some more tattooing on his arms. And what I really enjoyed, and the reason why I wanted to use an 8x10 camera is the clarity. The clarity of the piece is really good. You can actually read his thumbprints. It's that clear.
Wow.
I remember when I was doing it, the digital image was first coming in and somebody had told me, like, you can blow it up digitally. And I'm like, wait a minute. Digital image does not blow up. You can't, it doesn't do a blow up. The chemical will, but the digital won't. At that point, they just didn't have the resolution that could do that. So anyway, then along the sides of it are all these images of all the other tattoos that I had done, but that was all done in color, right? And I produced this work at a time when the black and white paper was really at its height. And there was this paper that was called Forte, and it was a Hungarian paper where they were using a lot of silver in it. And so the image itself is just, so beautiful because I remember I had to pay I think I purchased $500 worth of photo paper. I remember that, and I was just sweating bullets. It was like, oh my God, each one of those pieces. This better be good. But I knew the silver content was just gorgeous. And then the other thing too, the color photography was at its height at that point. And so those color prints that I did, actually I printed them, all of it at Hampshire College, it's just really on target in terms of the color on it. So you have this really vibrant color that is more or less like a margin around Felix. And then on the bottom of it, I had decided to create an altar because there's such a strong tradition with Chicano art, right, with the altar. And what I decided to do was use all of the kind of like the cultura kitsch imagery that you could purchase of the Guadalupe, and also the Virgen, and also, like lowrider culture. I remember I wanted to use roses. So I had these roses that I bought, I think at Michael's or something like that. And at the time, I hadn't really thought that I was going to use the roses. So I left all the price tags on them so I could take them all back.
It's the artist's way. Yes. I have some questions for you just kind of regarding the process of locating the right Guadalupe. What were your criteria, and also why Felix?
Yeah. One, I could get in.
Yeah.
And that was really important. And so that was Cecilio that got me in. Two, when I was able to get in and I saw because I photographed a lot of tattoos, and you'll see that in the piece itself.
Yes.
There's a lot of color work. So I photographed it in color, and I photographed it with 8x10 cameras and black and white. And I wanted to give myself enough material where I could really kind of work with it. And I realized that a lot of the work that I did was good. Any of them was going to do it. But what really spoke about the issues that I wanted to bring back to France was Felix Martinez. Right. And still, even to this day, we still deal with the idea of the Latino community being incarcerated. And it's not just an incarceration of criminal activity. Immigrants are incarcerated with their children, and they're separated, and babies. What is going on, along the border, the militarization of the border. And I remember when there was an outcry about the militarization of the border. It was back in the late 80s, and the Chicano community was already speaking about that. They were saying they're militarizing the border. We have to begin to talk about this and become aware as to why are they militarizing the border, which had never been militarized. I say it's such a cultural icon. It's not necessarily understood what the history is, but I always say it's kind of like a car wreck. Like when something really major happens, like a car wreck, like say on a road, and then all of a sudden all the cars stop at that, or they slow down where that car wreck was. And I think the Virgen is kind of like that. There was something really major that happened in terms of what Juan Diego was doing, and in terms of all of the temples that were being pulled down and the books that were burning and the catastrophic lives were changing, right? And I think the Guadalupe is a way where we can slow down. She allows us to slow down and still remember, right? Or at least honor, what had happened during that colonial period of time.
I do want to ask you, though, about your specific relationship to Guadalupe, and also if you happen to know what Felix's personal relationship to Guadalupe was.
The Guadalupe? Well, with Felix, I was introduced to him while he was in the detention center, right? And, that's kind of a tough story. It really is. The story is that, and this is what his counselor had told me, is that he was being prosecuted for a drive-by shooting. But the police believed that he did not do it.
Oh, wow.
He was a veterano from an area in Albuquerque where there was a lot of so-called gang activity, and he had just been released from prison, and they assumed that the younger gang members kind of talked to him about the drive-by, and that he probably knew who did it. And so what they were trying to do was get him to point out the shooter. And he wasn't going to. And then finally, there was talk about him pointing the shooter out, and he never made it out. Yeah. So, so the idea of protection, that's another idea, why prisoners get the Guadalupe on their backs is for protection.
And for you? Is she protection for you too, or does she take? Yeah,
she is.
Okay,
she is.
Yeah,
she's protection. She's protected her people for hundreds of years. Cesar Chavez walked with her, right?
Yeah.
The indigenous communities all over Mexico and the United States prayed to her. So she's the goddess of the Americas. Yeah. And she's been the goddess for thousands of years. We've crossed the border for thousands of years.
Yeah.
Back and forth.
Does she still appear in your work, or what have you done since you made this piece in 1998?
Oh, my goodness. I mean,
so many things.
Like I say, what I do is I make work about, during that era, the discussions that are going on,
Right.
Right. And so there for a while, I was thinking about malcriadas, like bad girls, right? And that's brought me into the idea of female boxers, women boxers.
Okay.
And then after that, I started really kind of thinking in terms of what was going on within the detention centers. And I got with a group of artists, and we started creating what is called Detention Nation. And there are installations that we would put up at different places dealing with the incarceration of the migrant communities that have been crossing the borders for thousands of years. Then I started thinking about the castas. And my latest work right now that I've been showing has a lot to do with the castas. And castas, people kind of look at me and say, what is a casta? A casta is, back in the 1700s, there was these paintings that were made during the colonial era to demonstrate the different configurations of Native, African, and Spaniard or European American, right? And out of the different children of all these different races, names are given. to them. So if, let's say, like a black woman had a child from a Spaniard, then the child would be considered a mulatto,
Mm-hmm.
right? If a Native woman had a child from a Spaniard, the child would be considered mestizo, right? And so these are names that we still know, right? And so when I was looking at all of this, I was thinking to myself, like, we still do this, right? And with it, there was a whole social hierarchy that they were demonstrating. And there was actually, these paintings are, if you really look at them, they're kind of hard to look at. If you think about them in terms of race. But, the other thing is Mexico sees them in terms of nationalism as well. So what I wanted to do was, like, how do you, going back to the idea of documentation or documentary, how do you document racism? It's right in front of us. We see it every day. We experience it. Certain people have more privilege than other people. Coming from a bicultural family, I see it really clearly. And so what I wanted to do was, like, I think the closest that we ever had to the documentation of racism was within these Casta paintings. And what I wanted to do was look at the aesthetic, see what they were doing there, and then redo it as a contemporary version, using contemporary people, using DNA, right, instead of labeling. So their labeling process had to do with enlightenment, and categorization, right? And then when the DNA came out, it was like, so that's almost a carryover because it's science, right? This is science. And who's making all the determinations as to who is what and percentage of what, right? And I thought, well, this is like the perfect time to do an updated version of the Casta paintings.
Wow.
My Casta works are also quite lovely, too. There's the photograph, and then there's also sort of like an extension of the photograph through objects and diagrams and I think shelving. I saw shelves.
What I did was I have these like little test tubes and a map. There's a map where National Geographic demonstrated to everybody how their DNA came out of East Africa and it moved on, through 100,000 years. And what you'll see with the Latino community, usually on the mother's side, it moves all the way into the Americas. Then also they had another one where, like, going 6 generations back, and it would be the biogeographic breakup in there. And so what I did with those is made a graph out of different colored sand. Because sand is, like humans, sand is sand, right? But there's different colors to sand. So that's why I use that metaphor. And then what they did with the Casta paintings, the families or people they portrayed really didn't have names. They were types, right? So what I wanted to do was to give the families a voice. And so I implanted a QR code in the photograph, right? So that you just put your phone across it, and what you get is a monologue of the family or one family member describing what they see.
Interesting.
Right. And telling us about their family line and if there was anything in the DNA that, they found unusual or whatever. So that when you're looking at the photograph, you can have that experience of having one of the family members standing right next to you.
Wow.
Talking to you.
So I want to go back to something you said about the Guadalupe on Felix's back being in the California style.
Yeah.
So can you talk about the different versions of Guadalupe that you encountered for this project and like what those differences are?
Oh, wow. All the differences are actually there in the mural itself because I photographed so many, ones that were done by different tattoo artists. There's ones that have been, done by amateur all the way up to, being paid high money for it. That's in the prisons, all of that. And with the Guadalupe, there's certain things that are just constant that have to be there or else it's not the Guadalupe.
Right.
And then there's certain things that'll just kind of like sort of show up. So some of the attributes is you have to have the raya that goes out like that. Another attribute is the head is tilted. There's a tilt to the head. That has to be there. Her hands are here. Underneath is the angel holding up it's kind of like a dark moon, right? But then what we see is like variations that circle around that, and so you can kind of like look for those variations. Like I'm thinking about Yolanda Lopez's, and she caught it, by the religious community for, how dare you do that to the Virgin? So what she did was she put her mother at a sewing machine with the rayas around, and she's sewing the cape. And her mother was a seamstress, working like for Pendleton or something like that, like in a factory. And then another one was her grandmother, very old, and she's holding the snake, right? She's holding the snake, and, the rayas are around her, and the colors are right. And so all the attributes are there. Her head is tilted, right? And then there's an image of Yolanda that is running, right? And she has her running shoes on, and she's running. And, one of the things that I realized when I was looking at the work of Yolanda Lopez is what she did is she made me think about what it meant to be a Latina. Here the Virgin of Guadalupe becomes what we're supposed to aspire to. But I'll never have a virgin birth, okay? That's not going to happen. So, even that, you can't obtain that, right? And so on one hand, the idea of the Guadalupe is beautiful, right? But on the other hand, as a Latina, she's somebody that I can aspire to. And I think what Yolanda did was she gave us that to look at. And that was like very important. I think one of the other, which is in the show, but remember I told you that I wanted the Guadalupe tattooed on a woman's back. And at that time, I couldn't find anybody that women just didn't put tattoos like that. Latinas just didn't put tattoos like that on their back. So I drew it. And I photographed my cousin, and she had this beautiful hair. And I dressed her backwards, because what I wanted to do is kind of like talk about how, in many ways, the Guadalupe is something we can't aspire to, we can't do. So in many ways, it's backwards for us, finding those cultural identities that are unapproachable, right?
And unapproachable because, not just because it's unattainable, but do you feel like there's that unapproachable component of like, this symbol almost being like foisted on a culture and then like adapted, or?
No, I guess what I'm saying is that she's an icon that goes beyond anything that we can possibly experience. She's an icon of sympathy. She's an icon of love. She's an icon that has given courage. All of these has happened with her, right? But as a Latina, I think it's important for us to have mentorship, right? And being able to be guided into a world that we can achieve and do. So I'm looking for something that, that is more attainable. I'm not saying that the Guadalupe isn't a beautiful part of our culture. I think she is. And I think it's good that she's reproduced over and over and over again. But I want to be realistic, too. That, we should be able to find our voices, right? And be understood as that we are part of the history and that we have done things. So she's not the only one that we can use. There's other women out there, Latinas out there, that have done powerful things that we can aspire to.
Delilah Montoya's mixed media photo mural, La Guadalupana, is on view at the New Mexico Museum of Art's Vladem Contemporary in Santa Fe until May 18, 2025, as a part of the Off-Center exhibition that features a survey of New Mexico art from 1970 to 2000. Visit nmartmuseum.org for location and visiting hours. Thank you for listening. Encounter Culture is a production of the New Mexico Department of Cultural Affairs. Our producer is Andrea Klunder at the Creative Imposter Studios. This season is produced and edited by Andrea Klunder and Alex Riegler, with additional editing by Monica Brain. Our recording engineers are Colin Underleiter and Cabby at Cabby Sound Studios in Santa Fe. Technical direction and post-production audio by Edwin R. Ruiz. Our executive producer is Daniel Zillman. Thank you to New Mexico artist El Brujo de Santinava for our theme music. For a full transcript and show notes, visit podcast.nmculture.org or click the link in the episode description in your listening app. I'm your host, Emily Withnall. The New Mexico Department of Cultural Affairs is your guide to the state's entire family of museums, historic sites, and cultural institutions. From native treasures to space exploration, world-class folk art to ancient dinosaurs, our favorite way to fully explore is with the New Mexico Culture Pass. To see everywhere Culture Pass is accepted and reserve yours today, visit nmculture.org/visit/culturepass. And if you love New Mexico, you'll love El Palacio magazine. Subscribe at elpalacio.org. Thank you for listening. And if you learned something new, send this episode to a friend or share it on social media. We love celebrating the cultures of New Mexico together.